Welcome back to Buddhist PhD Responds. I'm Dr. Jared Jones. My research specialties are Buddhist philosophy, ancient systems of meditation, and the cognitive science of meditation. This is part of a series where I respond to philosophers, theologians, academics, and interesting things that I find around the internet about Buddhism to help correct common misunderstandings about Buddhism and increase people's understanding of what Buddhism actually is. Today I'm going to be looking at the sermons, writings, and books of Ravi Zacharias. In particular, I read the vast majority of two of his books in which he addresses Buddhism, the Buddha, the Dharma, and so forth. One is Jesus amongst other gods, and the other is the Lotus and the Cross. I'm also going to be covering videos that he made, public sermons that he gave. I'm going to cover a lot of ground. This should be educational, even if you're taking sort of a passive interest and would like to know more about Buddhism. Unlike the previous video dealing with Dr. Timothy Tennant's statements, I'm actually going to be going much deeper into the subject of what is Buddhism and why is it interesting. Let's get into it. So let's first begin with his work, Jesus Among Other Gods. In this work, Ravi Zacharias is looking at whether or not Buddha, Muhammad, and other religious figures from history can stack up to the miracles and the authority of Jesus Christ. One of the things that he picks out early in the book on page 32 is the fact that Jesus has a miraculous birth. When he compares this with the life of the Buddha, he says the Buddha has no such claim to any kind of miraculous birth. However, this is not true. According to the Buddhist canon, the Buddha descended from Tushita heaven. Whether you're dealing with the Mahayana canon or the Theravada canon, it doesn't matter. When the Buddha descended into his mother's womb after a long selection process, deciding which womb to enter into, Buddha is then born out of his mother's side. And then the Buddha takes 7 strides immediately after being born, takes 7 steps, and declares right there in front of his mother, "I am supreme in this world." This is not an ordinary birth. This is not the description of the ordinary process by which a human being comes to be born. So from birth, Buddha is described as being capable of various types of miracles, and his birth itself is miraculous. Next, on page 32 to 33 in the same book, Ravi Zacharias makes this argument. There was a second way in which Jesus proved his absolute and eternal existence. His life has always been regarded as the purest that has ever been lived. On numerous occasions, his antagonists were challenged to bring some contrary proof against him. They were never able to besmirch his pristine life. He challenged his adversaries to lay any charge of sin at his feet, and in brief, they failed. He says further on, by contrast, no other individual has ever elicited such accolades by their own admission. This includes Muhammad, Buddha, and Krishna. This is actually not true. So the Buddha, likewise, in his last rebirth, committed no evil actions, no negative karma. Of course, through infinite previous rebirths, a great inspiration to us Buddhists, thankfully, he was an ordinary being, had all sorts of problems, made all sorts of mistakes, just like you and me, and thus we know from the Buddha's description of his own past lives that you and I can go from the state we're in now to the state of enlightenment. So far from being a gotcha, I think the fact that the Buddha led an exemplary ethical life from birth to death in his final rebirth, and the fact that in his previous rebirths, the Buddha lived just like us and developed to the place that he eventually got, is a dramatic inspiration for us, not something to criticize. In particular, not from a insider's Buddhist perspective. He then makes various arguments about chemistry, fine-tuning, the improbability of the arising of life, and I've commented on this a great deal. I think that although I'm not particularly convinced by fine-tuning arguments, if someone were to make that argument, and if that case were made really well, that there's fine-tuning and that's the only way to explain how life arises, Buddhists actually have a pretty well-developed explanation for why that would be. And I've done videos on this in the past. You can look those up. I've also commented in the community section of YouTube, so I'm not going to do it again here. Now on page 63, we find this. Whatever we may make of their claims, one reality is inescapable. They are teachers who point to their teaching or show some particular way. In all of these, there emerges an instruction, a way of living. It is not Zoroaster to whom you turn, it is Zoroaster to whom you listen. It is not Buddha who delivers you, it is his Four Noble Truths that instruct you, and so forth. By contrast, Jesus did not only teach or expound his message, he was identical with his message. In other words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is said to be an embodiment of what is actually true. Jesus is said to be an embodiment of the path or the way to truth. And Jesus is said to be the embodiment of life, which can be interpreted in a number of different ways. It can be interpreted to mean that Jesus himself is eternal life, or that Jesus represents an eternal kind of relationship that is possible for human beings. A number of other interpretations are there. This is also covered in the other book, The Lotus and the Cross, on page 32, where Ravi writes, speaking as Jesus, speaking to the Buddha, the purpose of life, Gautama, is communion, not union. There can be no meaning when the goal is to meditate oneself into oblivion, but meaning is found in relationship with the living God. That's what it's all about, a relationship. And I'm the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. He who comes to me will be fulfilled. I work the miracle of extinguishing destructive hungers and planting new legitimate hungers to take their place. I give to you life that's abundant. I offer a new relationship. So you can see both the relationship interpretation and the eternal life interpretation of this life concept there in that description, I think. So what about the Buddha? Does the Buddha simply claim to reveal a path, that he has a truth that is utterly independent of who the Buddha is, and that by following that truth that you attain what he attained? Well, there is certainly aspects of that idea in Buddha's writings, but listen to this. This is from the Vikali Sutta. Vikali was ill, he was a monk, he was about to pass away, and he wanted to see the Buddha before he passed away. And he says, "For a long time, Venerable Sir, I have wanted to come to see the Blessed One, but I haven't been fit enough to do so." And the Buddha replies, "Enough, Vikali. One who sees the Dharma sees me. One who sees me sees the Dharma. For in seeing the Dharma, Vikali, one sees me, and in seeing me, one sees the Dharma." What is the Dharma? The Dharma is the truth. The Dharma is the way. And the Dharma of interdependent origination is infinite relationship forever. The Dharma of selflessness is the pathway, or is the fact about you that leads to a permanent, infinite state of happiness for you and for other beings. So there's actually quite a bit of similarity between the claim being made by the Buddha, i.e., that the Buddha himself is the living embodiment of the way, the truth, and the life which he claims to bring to others. So actually, there's quite a bit of similarity between these two statements. The Buddha is the Dharma. The Buddha is the Sangha. And then, of course, the Buddha is the Buddha. So the Buddha is all three elements of the Triple Gem, for those of you who are familiar with Buddhist refuge. On page 63 of the first book and page 16 of the second book, Ravi makes the same argument. He says, Buddhism is legalistic. Let me read you the passage from Lotus and the Cross. This is Jesus once again speaking to the Buddha. But something else quickly stands out. Rules, scores of rules, like a noose, tauntingly swaying above the head, ready at the hint of one wrong move to be tightened around the neck. I see all the laws of conduct written in various centers around your teaching. He also makes this sort of argument again on page 30 of the same book. This is an argument that he makes over and over and over again, that basically Buddhism is just a bunch of rules that the Buddha came up with that a person is meant to follow, that are constraining, deeply constraining, also troubling in their constraint of your activities, okay? And once again, I don't think this could be further from the truth. If you look at what the Vinaya is and what it's supposed to do for a person, the Vinaya for monastic rules has all sorts of categories, and each category has a specific function in terms of why that rule is there and what it's supposed to do. So there are rules in the Vinaya, the ethical code of conduct for monks and nuns, that pertain to increasing your ability to have mindfulness, so that your mindfulness in terms of training for meditation becomes stronger and stronger and stronger day by day, just because of how you are comporting yourself or behaving. And like this, there are rules that also help you maintain relationships with other members of the community, including other religious communities. And I think it's fair to say, if we were to look at the rules of conduct for Christian monastic communities, we would find that they are similarly complex. Furthermore, if we were to look at the various ways that different groups of Christian thought have dealt with the issue of ethics, we'd find that Christian ethics are actually quite complicated also. So I don't really understand why he's making this argument, considering that this is something you find in every religion, that they have lots of things you're supposed to do or not do, and that's not unique to Buddhism.
I remember talking to the first woman monk who was from Thailand to be ordained into the Buddhist priesthood. She has a PhD in philosophy from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and Waterloo, I guess, Ontario, McMaster University there. Got her PhD in philosophy, and she gave me the first interview. We chatted for well over an hour, one-on-one, and I sort of angled into some questions because I didn't want to be too discourteous. And one of the things I said to her is, I hear you're married. And she said, yes. I said, you have children? She said, yes. I said, but you're living in a temple by yourself? She said, yes. I said, do you not see your children? She started crying. She said, I have a car. I said, you have a car? She said, yeah. I said, okay. And she says, every evening at the end of the day, I try and meet up with one of my children. She said, this is the hardest part of my life. I said, so you are on the journey to extinguishing the desire to be with your children. Is that right? Is that a fair assessment? She kept quiet.
I grew up in Maryland. That's where I lived for the first 20 years of my life. And then I entered the convent, 16-hour drives, the furthest I had ever been from my family for any extended period of time. And I was committing to the possibility of a life where I could be sent anywhere in the world. So we're the Daughters of St. Paul. We're in over 50 countries. And so I was opening myself to the possibility of being sent anywhere in the world, which was exciting, but also terrifying.
There have been many comments and emails, very serious and well thought, clearly personal comments, which we've received in response to our previous video. There has been one particular comment that touched me and opened my heart. And it opened my heart because it was clearly an email written from a personal struggle. And it also touched me personally because as a monastic, I've actually had to confront this situation. A young man wrote to ask if, given the fact that he is the only Orthodox in his family, and given everything that we've said about this new age of spiritual struggle that is opening before us, whether or not it is allowed or a blessed thing for him to put distance between himself and the members of his family. I think the answer to your question, which again is an answer I've had to give myself at the very beginning of my monastic life, is that there are distances and distances. And there is a type of inner distance, an interior distancing from one's family, which is not only advisable or possible, but is indeed blessed, and I strongly believe even necessary. There is a distancing from one's family and friends, from one's circle in life, that makes you not of the world, but of Christ. Something that sets you apart as belonging to Christ. You may still be active within your family and within your circle of friends, but deep down, there's a distance. And that distance will safeguard both your personal values, your faith in Christ, and the values that come with that faith, while at the same time allowing your friendship and your family relations to continue. I've often thought about this distance as almost a gift we make to our families and our friends, and an inner separation from those around us is healthy and blessed. It creates this space where they can make mistakes without us being destroyed by their mistakes, or indeed we can make mistakes. And because of this distance, we can repent of them and we can get up from these mistakes without having hurt them. And this is nothing new. I think of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. Think of that. Think of Abraham's attempt at the commandment of God to sacrifice, to kill his own son. That distance that happened in that moment when he bound his son and lifted up the knife to sacrifice Isaac, that distance that must have caught roots in that moment must have survived in his heart, in Abraham's heart, in Isaac's heart for their entire lives. It did not create a break between them. Abraham was still the father of Isaac, and he went back with his son and he took care of his son and raised him, and they had a family. But deep down, that separation, that distance that he put between himself and his son in the name of obedience and faith for God, that was always there. And that distance made Abraham the saint that he is, and that distance allowed for Isaac to become the saint that he became. But what are we talking about? Think about Christ. Think about the unthinkable, beyond human love that he and his beloved mother, the Theotokos, share. How much he loves her and how much she loves him. And yet he distances himself from her and addresses her with woman on several occasions, because he knows that what will happen to him will hurt her otherwise. It does not diminish his love for her, but it safeguards it and saves both of them from unnecessary pain. There was enough pain as it was. So what I'm saying to you, my dear one, is yes, you can take distance. You can separate yourself inside from your family so that their abuse towards you and your faith don't hurt you. And also so that their abuse is minimized, so that their sin is minimized. If they become violent against you, then separate yourself physically as well. But whatever you do, don't let this separation affect your love for them, your respect for them, and definitely not your prayer for them. Pray for them. The more difficult, the more against you they are, pray for them, and that will make you Christ-like, and that will save both you and them.
Let me just briefly say I have tremendous respect for monastics in the Christian tradition. The monastic path, no matter what tradition you're in, is extremely difficult and involves this challenge of spiritually and physically separating yourself from your family. And that's not easy. It's not easy if you're a Hindu renunciate. It's not easy if you're a Jain renunciate. It's not easy if you're a Buddhist renunciate. And it's not easy if you're a Christian renunciate. And I think the way that Ravi frames this extremely difficult struggle that people go through is a bit insensitive to the depth and the importance of the spiritual struggle that someone is going through in making that kinds of decision. So if Ravi's point is that in general there should be no such thing as monasticism because of that reason, okay, fair enough. Some people hold that position. But this struggle that he's describing on the part of a Buddhist nun is not unique to being a nun in the Buddhist tradition. It's something I think that you would find across the spectrum of people who are trying to live the monastic life. Again, it doesn't mean that you don't love your family. It doesn't mean that you don't care for your family. It just means that you have decided, you have been convinced that there's more than just this lifetime and the stakes are higher than just this lifetime, and you want to go all in all the time. So I don't really understand his point. There are common elements to religion, and some of those elements in terms of spiritual struggle, trying to improve our character against our most base, most harmful impulses, is something that we all share in common as people who are striving in religion, let's say. But we strive to accomplish that end of improved character, improved ethics, and so forth by following different systems. Do I think that the outcome of all those systems is exactly the same? I don't know. But we do actually share this spiritual struggle, and I think that's important to point out. And I don't think we should minimize that by reducing ethics to legalism. Moving on now to the Lotus and the Cross. The Lotus and the Cross is a text about a hypothetical conversation between Jesus and Buddha, where they're discussing a young woman by the name of Priya, who suffered extreme physical abuse, who lived as a prostitute, became infected with AIDS, and who died by suicide. This was a story that Ravi had read in the newspaper, and so he worked her story into a dialogue between Jesus and Buddha about how he thinks both worldviews, both religious leaders would deal with such a heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking case. So I believe she died around the age of 25. If there are members of her family or anything who eventually see this, again, my heart goes out to you. The only reason I'm using this is because he uses it in his book, and you kind of need to understand what's going on in order to understand the dialogue. So I'm now going to go through the critical arguments he makes, and in my view, the misunderstandings and misrepresentations of the Buddhist worldview that he makes along the way. And of course, you can guess that he gives the victory to Jesus in the end, so that's not a surprise. But the misrepresentations and errors he makes on the way to narratively crafting that victory on the part of Jesus are actually interesting for all of us. So let's go. On page 12, he has Buddha speaking to Priya with this advice. Free yourself now from the illusions of God and forgiveness and individual life hereafter. Invest in a life of good deeds that will outweigh the bad ones. That's your only hope. Make your heart pure, and that will offset all of your impure acts and thoughts. Skipping ahead a bit. And, you see, Jesus, even with what you just said, you were misleading Priya. My early followers made the same mistake you're making. You said that we must get back to dealing with what she, quote unquote, personally needs. That's one of the core differences between you and me. This idea of, quote, personal is a delusion. First of all, my goodness, the Buddha, when you read our canon, was one of the most incredibly skillful, personally inspiring teachers in the history of humankind. His ability to work with people was absolutely stunningly and astonishingly personal, not impersonal. The story of KIsa Gautami is one of a young woman who gets married, gives birth to a son, and she's very devoted to her family and her son. As her child is learning to walk, he trips and falls over. This is every mother's worst nightmare. And as he falls over and lands on the ground, suddenly he's motionless. And she rushes over to her son, tries to do something to get him back going, tries to do something to save his life, but nothing works. She goes from door to door asking people if anyone has medicine that could cure her son. But everyone she asks says, I'm sorry, your son is beyond the help of any medicine. And she's so distraught, and she can't accept that her child has passed away. And so she continues to wander from place to place with her dead son's body in her arms. Finally, someone recommends that she go to the Buddha, that the Buddha might be able to help. She goes straight to the Buddha, lays her child there at his feet, and says, "Please, I've heard that you're a great saint. I've heard you're a greatly accomplished person. Help my son." And the Buddha says, "Go to one of the homes in this village that we're in and just bring me a few mustard seeds from a family that's never experienced death." And she says, "Of course, I'll go right away." And she rushes off. She rushes off to get these mustard seeds so that the Buddha can help her. And as she goes from house to house to house to house, she meets family after family after family who have all had someone pass away. A son, a daughter, a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, an uncle, an aunt, a grandmother, a grandfather. Every family has suffered loss and death. And suddenly it occurs to her, everyone dies. Everyone passes away. And she's finally, through this exercise of going and talking to these families and seeing the truth of the matter, she's able to come to peace with the death of her son and to bury him and to move on with her life. And then, of course, she became a student of the Buddha, trained for the rest of her life, and became highly accomplished, and to this day is still considered one of the Buddha's foremost disciples. So the Buddha was quite skillful and quite personal in the way that he dealt with and built upon and helped people through their individual issues and their individual problems and the individual way in which they need to approach the path in order to make progress. So I think it is a gross misrepresentation of who the Buddha is and how he teaches to say that because we teach selflessness, therefore the Buddha's teachings are completely impersonal. On page 14, Jesus says, "Abraham came more than 2,000 years before you," talking to Buddha, "and just for the record, before Abraham was, I am." And the Buddha responds, "That was quite a response, Jesus. I must take note of it because my followers do pride themselves in dating my earthly sojourn before yours. But I see your point. How can time argue with eternity? From a Buddhist standpoint, all of us, every single one of us, is an infinite causal sequence into the past. So see the move that's been made here. See the move that's been made here. Actually, all of us, according to Buddhism, are infinite beings. Yes, it's a causal process for the Buddhists in the comment section who are getting ready to type that I'm creating an eternal soul that shouldn't be there. Buddhism says you have a mind stream that's a causal series of events with no first cause. That series of events goes infinitely into the past. Infinitely into the past. There have been infinite universes, and your mind has inhabited infinite forms across infinite universes for infinite time. So all of us, in an important sense, are timeless beings. So this sort of statement, how could time argue with eternity, does not make any sense from a Buddhist standpoint. We've all been here forever, and we're all going to be here forever with each other in relationships of various kinds with each other. Just a quick aside. I don't charge for the content I make. I'm working really hard to never have to put ads on my content. And I also teach meditation classes, usually every day here on YouTube, as well as doing live Q&A sessions. And I do a fair number of phone calls helping people with their Buddhist practice. I don't charge for any of this. I don't even charge for the retreats that I do from time to time, training people in meditation. So if you're finding value in what you're receiving from this video, please do click one of the links below, become a member, join the Discord, go to the GoFundMe or the Venmo or whatever I have down there by the time you see this, and make a contribution, especially because, at least at the time of making this video, it's very early days. Every bit that comes in really does help me to carry on doing this full time. And at the moment, I'm spending between 70 and 100 hours a week doing this, and I don't want to stop. I want to keep going. So if this is valuable to you, then please make a contribution so that I can carry on doing this for free for everyone who isn't able to contribute. On page 16, there's another passage where Jesus is responding to Gautama, who said, according to Ravi Zacharias, that basically all desires are bad. And Jesus says, "Unshackled from desire." What a statement, Gautama. extinguishing all hungers. An incredible ideal. Just think about it, though. How could it be possible that all desires are wrong? That issue alone could dominate our discussion, couldn't it? And my goodness, yes, it could. It could dominate our entire discussion because the Buddha never said that. As a matter of fact, as I said in the previous video, the Buddha said your desire to get free from samsara needs to be so powerful that it's like a person whose hair or clothing is on fire looking for a pond in which to dive. So you have to have desire to overcome desire. This is absolutely critical in terms of Buddhist thought. And Buddhist psychology has different types of desires. Some desires can't lead to happiness. If you'd like to see more about these different types of desires, go back to the Timothy Tennant response and click on the part of that video where I talk about tanha, raga, and these sorts of things. This is a very common misunderstanding of Buddhism. You got to have desire to strive on the path to nirvana. And once you've attained the path, it's sort of like going to the store to buy a jug of milk. As soon as you get to the store and you have that milk in your hand, the desire to purchase the milk goes away all on its own. You don't have to do some extra thing. You don't end up in an infinite progress of desires that you can't get out of. You just have the desire to get the milk. You go to the store, you grab the milk. When the milk is in your hand and paid for and you're on your way home, at some point in that process, the desire just goes away. Why does it go away? Because you have the milk now, right? Likewise, when you need powerful desire to get you to nirvana, but once you have the attainment of nirvana, there's no cause for the desire to get it anymore because you have it, right? So this is something that's actually common sense. We do this all the time, and there's no contradiction lurking in there. Furthermore, take a look at these clips.
Thailand's first ordained monk, a woman, got her doctoral from McMaster University here and then became ordained in Sri Lanka and was living in Thailand. I had about 3 hours with her when I wrote my book, The Lotus and the Cross, Jesus Talks to Buddha. And I asked her, who has attained that nirvana, or what you talk about in the Eightfold Path or the Four Noble Truths? And she said, I would say it is the Dalai Lama. I said, the Dalai Lama has as his primary pursuit now the freedom of Tibet. So I said, but in your philosophy, to desire something is short of nirvana. The goal is to not even desire. That's actually what nirvana means. You cease to even will or want. She said, that's right. I said, can you tell me why he desires the liberation of Tibet? I said, why does he desire that? And she just looked at me. She said, can I say that he chooses to? She looked at me and she said, we try not to get into these philosophical questions. Let's just say that he chooses to. So I said, you're telling me that he's choosing to do something that is hurtful for his journey.
So why does the Dalai Lama have desire? Because on the Bodhisattva path, you have the desire to liberate all sentient beings from suffering. You have a desire that all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. And you in a condition, in a mental state of non-abiding nirvana, through these virtuous desires that are not delusional, because it is possible to bring other beings to nirvana and enlightenment. It is possible to help other beings achieve happiness and freedom from suffering. So this isn't a delusional desire, and therefore doesn't fit into that delusional category of desire that I discussed in the Dr. Tennant video. So there's no contradiction whatsoever between the Dalai Lama having the desire for all beings to have happiness and freedom from suffering, and the Dalai Lama being in a nirvanic state of mind. Those two actually, according to the Mahayana in particular, have to come together. The only thing that would if the Dalai Lama has achieved nirvana internally, the only thing that would stop him from entering into abiding nirvana, rather than remaining in non-abiding nirvana, is his desire to benefit other beings. That's how it works. It may be that that particular nun just didn't know this information. That's possible. Or maybe it's that he's not remembering the story correctly to be charitable. But the one thing's quite clear, desire can be positive or negative in Buddhism. There are good desires and bad desires. There are helpful desires and unhelpful desires. There are really important, powerful motivations you need to develop if you want to train really seriously in Buddhism. And there are powerful motivations you already have that don't work, that don't serve you and don't serve anybody else, that you need to eliminate along the path to achieving nirvana or non-abiding nirvana on your way to Buddhahood. In continuing to try to establish the authority of Jesus over Buddha in this book, he includes this particular miracle. When Nathaniel and I had finished talking, he had a glimpse of heaven itself. Few experiences are as jolting as really knowing yourself for the first time through meeting someone else. That's the power and unpretentiousness of truth. In other words, he's saying that seeing is believing. Well, let's take a look at an example from the Buddhist canon. There was a monk named Nanda, Venerable Nanda, and Venerable Nanda was a resident at Jeta's Grove Monastery. Venerable Nanda was becoming displeased with his monastic life because he recalled a very beautiful girl that he had seen before he had become a monk and wanted to get back to propose to this girl and re-enter family life, let's say. And so the Buddha goes to Nanda and shows him a vision of a heavenly realm and says, listen, Nanda, I'm going to be your guarantor. If you train in Buddhist ethics and you train as a monk, you're going to take rebirth in this incredible heavenly realm. And by comparison, these are Nanda's words, not mine, the girl that he knew from back in his village, who was the envy of the countryside, was like a cauterized monkey with its ears and nose cut off compared to the beautiful forms that the beings in the Deva realm inhabit. And thus, Nanda was convinced to carry on in his monastic life, and being so enthusiastic about attaining a heavenly rebirth through his monastic endeavors, he continued traveling down the path. Now, something interesting happened, which is that people came to know that Nanda wasn't trying to attain nirvana, that he was simply trying to attain heavenly rebirth so that he could be reborn in the presence of beautiful devas. And so they started making fun of him a little bit, you know? And due to being made fun of a little bit, Nanda became even more serious about his practice. And as he got even more serious about his practice, Nanda began to experience the results of practice, which are way, 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 way better than any sensory pleasure he could have enjoyed in the human realm or the Deva realm. And through this very skillful approach of working with Nanda based upon what his drives, his needs, his interests, his sort of unique obsession with the opposite sex and so forth, by working with Nanda on his own terms, on his own ground, the Buddha took him from an ordinary person who simply just wanted to get married, you know, kind of regretted doing the monk thing, to a person who wanted to attain heavenly rebirth rather than simply remaining as an ordinary person in the world, to a person who was diligently striving to attain realizations, and then finally to a person who actually achieved nirvana in a single lifetime. So the Buddha says, Nanda, having comprehended your awareness with my own awareness, in other words, the Buddha looked at his consciousness and was aware of what Nanda had achieved through clairvoyance. I realized, Nanda, that through the ending of the effluence, so on and so forth, that you had achieved nirvana, and you had achieved it for yourself right here in the here and now, before dying. Through this, the Buddha was able to skillfully work with Nanda, encourage him to continue down the path, and Nanda actually achieves the goal instead of remaining distracted by this idea of heavenly rebirth. So the ability to show another being a heavenly realm is also an ability that the Buddha possessed according to the Buddhist canon. Next, page 17. Jesus says to Buddha in the book, "The fact is that countless numbers have sought the way of renunciation, in other words, become monks or nuns and lived in isolation to pursue meditation. Some have sat in caves for a lifetime in meditative silence. I see them even now. I hear them in their wordless cries, but Gautama, you've not seen their hearts as I have." According to Buddhism, a Buddha is a type of being who's omniscient. He sees the mind of all beings everywhere all the time. So the Buddha is completely aware of the minds of beings. Priya continues, I've heard about them in other lands. Are you talking about some of those in the caves of Tibet who've been alone in meditation for 10, 15 years? I mean, how can they do that? If that's what it takes, scores of rules for some, silence for decades for others, what chance do I have basically, right? As an ordinary person. If it takes decades in caves to do all of this, why should I even start? Well, according to Buddhism, you've already been at this for limitless, countless lifetimes. What's a few years in a cave? And if you can't do the cave thing, there's other pathways for you. Train in ethics in this lifetime, be humble, train in your teachers, do some studies. Next lifetime, you can be a greatly accomplished practitioner, or at least like a middling practitioner. And then the next lifetime after this, then you can be a great practitioner. Right? So since infinite time has passed and you haven't got out, what's 10 or 15 more lifetimes? What's 3 more lifetimes? What's a couple more lifetimes to accomplish a permanent solution to your problems? It's actually not that big a deal. Furthermore, you have a ton of chance. According to the Mahayana, there are pure lands, and the power of the Buddhas, like Amitabha, to be able to pull you up into a pure land, a heavenly realm where you can finish your training, is actually quite easy. This is something that anybody can do. Recite the name of Amitabha, learn his sutra, learn the name of Sukvati, and through the power of the Buddha, combined with your faith, your devotion, your ethics, your recitation, you can be lifted up into a heavenly realm. And in this particular heavenly realm, called a pure land, it's a class of heavenly realm. It's headed by a Buddha. You're surrounded by other practitioners. And in this place, you can carry on and finish your training. So even for somebody who is totally illiterate, let's say, totally uneducated, let's say, totally maybe even incapable of learning all of the complexities and details and doing the training for years and blah, 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 even for that person, there's a perfectly reasonable pathway they can take to go from where they are now to full realization over the course of a few lifetimes. And considering that from a Buddhist standpoint, we've already been at this forever, a few lifetimes is not a big deal. In addition to that, according to Buddhism, there are all sorts of other categories of realization that come quite often before a person would take rebirth as the type of person who'd be interested in spending 10 years in a cave. There's stream entry, where you have created enough momentum, in my understanding of the term, created enough momentum that now you're headed down the path. You're not going to completely lose contact with the path, and you will continue in that direction until you achieve the ultimate realizations, perhaps over a course of a number of lifetimes. Then there's non-return, where a person takes rebirth in what's called a pure abode, which is sort of like the Pali equivalent of a pure land. It's a little bit harder to get into those. And there are pure lands in the Mahayana that are quite difficult to get into as well, by the way. But in the pure abodes, through your training up to that point, you attain a heavenly kind of rebirth in which you're surrounded by practitioners and you finish your practice, you finish your training, and you attain enlightenment in that pure abode. The Buddha that we know and love was at one time just like us, which is what proves that we can do it also. This is inspiring. This doesn't mean that if some people are living in caves, all hope is lost for you. What it actually means is those people who are living in caves at one time in a previous rebirth are exactly where you are now. Or even perhaps you are that type of person, and 30 years from now, the circumstances will align through your training, through your karma, through your merit, that you do go into a cave for 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, because there are still people doing this. So yeah, at some point you're going to have to do some really serious training and practice. That's true. But if that's not what you can do in this lifetime, there are dozens of other pathways you can take as a practitioner that are completely valid and are taking you further down the path. And that's all that's required. That is all that is required. And there was something, to continue with the story here, there were things and are things that a person in a very difficult circumstance could do if they weren't capable of going into a cave for 10 years. Most of us aren't capable of going into a cave for 10 years, but you develop the merit and karma that allows you to do that through training in other things throughout the course of a lifetime or two. On page 21, Buddha says, "But prayer is a dimension that doesn't fit with my teaching." And skipping ahead a bit, Jesus responds, "With the desire of your followers to make a petition for their needs, there is no one to whom they can go. In other words, he's making the criticism that in Buddhism, if someone were to pray seeking the help and guidance of a higher power, there is no guidance of a higher power that could be offered. And this is not true. This is dramatically untrue. First of all, there are the Dharma kings. And these beings, according to the Pali Canon, can be relied upon to help you to some degree. Furthermore, if you look at the Jataka tales, the Buddha's own life, there are tons and tons of devas, gods, deities, who help the Buddha throughout the entire course of his training as a bodhisattva from lifetime to lifetime. Furthermore, according to the Mahayana sources, there are celestial bodhisattvas, there are celestial Buddhas who are emanating or appearing with limitless numbers of appearances, limitless numbers of bodies, inspiring you, leading you, trying to get you to go further down the path. And if you make prayers to these beings, they will respond to your prayers. Yes, from your side, you have to have the karma to be benefited, and you have to have a relationship with those beings to be benefited, but you can still pray to beings who are higher than yourself for help, including some cases asking devas or other deities for help, including in some cases asking bodhisattvas for help, including in some cases asking Buddhas for help. It really depends on where you're at in your practice and what types of beings you're relying upon and what sort of attitude you have when you're asking for that assistance. And there are going to be some in the comment section, I think, who say, yes, but aren't you not supposed to rely on devas and deities that aren't Buddhist? Yeah, but there are also some devas that are Buddhists. And I sometimes say, if you ask someone over to your house to help you move your couch, you're not taking refuge in that person. You just know that you don't have the strength to move your couch on your own. So, likewise, if you were to ask a particular deva, a particular deity for help that isn't a Buddha or bodhisattva, as long as from the bottom of your heart you're not taking refuge in that deity as if that deity could take you from where you are to full enlightenment if you followed all of their advice, then, at least in my understanding, you're not violating your refuge commitments, your refuge vows, for those who are familiar with those commitments. So you can have friends in high places. If you had a friend that was the governor of the city in which you lived and you were trying to get something done, maybe they could help you because they have more power than you. That doesn't mean you take refuge in them to take you from where you are to full enlightenment. So as long as your mind is understanding, okay, there are some devas out there, they can actually help, they can be friends with me, right? There are celestial Buddhas and bodhisattvas, of course, who are already working infinitely and tirelessly for my benefit. And these beings can actually help you. They can actually see you down the path. They can actually benefit you in various ways. All of this is part of Buddhism. Accordingly, prayer and worship are part of Buddhism. In the Pali Dhammapada, the Buddha states that worshiping those with, quote, perfected minds, even for a single moment, is better than making thousands of offerings and sacrifices to other beings. Though month after month, for 100 years, one should offer sacrifices by the thousands, yet, if only for a moment, one should worship those with perfected minds, that honor is indeed better than a century of sacrifice, and so on and so forth. If you go through the canon, you'll find statement after statement after statement where the Buddha is allowing his followers to worship him, to venerate his monks and nuns. And this is entirely consistent with his teachings overall by implication. Furthermore, beyond simple implication, the Buddha actually makes various statements to this effect. Here's another one from the Dhammapada. If you worship those worthy of worship, awakened ones and their disciples, who've transcended objectification, crossed over lamentation and grief, who are unendangered, fearless, unbound, there's no measure of reckoning that your merit, your good karma that's produced by doing this is this much. In other words, your karma can't be measured if you worship those worthy of worship. In other words, awakened beings and their followers. There are unequivocal statements like this in the Pali Canon, and it carries on, of course, straight through the Mahayana Canon and into the Tantric Canon. Let's carry on. On page 22, there's a criticism that's a little bit heavier hitting, And I'd like to highlight this one a little bit. Jesus says, "That's the reason I was careful to say that your disciples were able to change your assumptions and your conclusions, not the form, but the very substance. This is never true of God, who knows the beginning from the end. A plea for mercy does not diminish God's perfect knowledge. In fact, it is part of the pattern God has designed for responding to sincere heart." What is he talking about here? There are a couple of places in the Bible where God responds to someone's plea for mercy and could be interpreted as changing his mind. And so he's trying to head off that objection. Let me put something a little different on the screen. Consider the promise to David, right? The promise to David that his throne would endure forever, if taken at face value, would seem to mean that your kingdom and your throne, your empire, your power with your family line will go on completely forever, right? So in a material sense, certainly, Christians, I think, will agree, of course, that in a material sense, that promise is absolutely not fulfilled. The kingdom that David was overseeing is no longer being run by that family. Now, Christians might argue, well, it was fulfilled in some spiritual sense in the person of Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ, in continuing the line of David as an eternal ruler over the world, has maintained the kingdom of David and the line of David forever. Okay, fine. Let's just sort of take that on face value, but look at what this requires for us to accept. It requires that we accept who Jesus was. It requires that we accept Jesus' resurrection. It requires, I think, also perhaps that we accept his ascension in bodily form into heaven to rule as his destiny is written forever. And that's a pretty heavy lift for someone who doesn't accept all of the other claims of Christianity. And thus, the tools a Christian must use to establish the fulfillment of this promise are spiritual tools. They're spiritual explanations for how this promise is fulfilled, and therefore how God doesn't change in answering his promise. Yes? And so from my standpoint, as someone who believes the Buddha was in fact omniscient, I would argue that those cases where the Buddha seems to be changing his mind about something, rather than demonstrating a lack of knowledge, are demonstrating a particular type of skill in dealing with sentient beings. Buddhists who believe that the Buddha is omniscient have a number of spiritual tools at their disposal in terms of their worldview to explain those cases where it seems like the Buddha has really changed his mind about something based upon learning new information. And the biggest sort of piece of the puzzle that I wouldn't be accepted by Christians, but it doesn't really matter, right? So just in terms of examples we've already covered, think about the example of the mustard seed. Do you think the Buddha didn't know that Gautami wasn't going to be able to find a house where death had never occurred? Do you think that was a surprise to the Buddha? No. The Buddha is working with the different inclinations of various beings to create the most powerful psychological effects for those beings to make progress. Likewise, there are other instances, at least in my humble view as a Buddhist, where it seems like the Buddha has changed his mind based upon new information, whereas the Buddha is using various circumstances to create the most powerful effects in his followers, both at the time and in the future. Furthermore, and this is going to be much more difficult to accept for those who are not Buddhist, totally fine, just fast forward by 10 or 15 seconds. A Buddha is a type of being who can appear in multiple bodies. So there are even cases we could look to in the canon where we say, well, yeah, the Buddha is appearing over here, and there's another being appearing over here who seems to be having various problems or is asking certain types of questions and challenging the Buddha in a certain way that would lead one to think the Buddha is not omniscient. However, these types of appearances are one of the ways in which Buddhas help ordinary sentient beings make progress down the path. So, for what it's worth, we do have resources to explain these kinds of instances, just like Christians do. To carry on to page 23, Jesus says, "I know the number of hairs on your head, Priya. I know when every sparrow falls to the ground. I intimately know and care about how your heart aches. I even knew you before you came to be." Of course, the implication being that the Buddha doesn't know any of this information. Strap in. This is probably not the best subject for those who don't believe in Buddhist stuff, but very, very important if you're Buddhist, whether you're following the Pali tradition, or you're following the Sanskrit tradition, or you're following the Chinese Agamas, or you're following Tibetan tradition, this still applies to you. When you look at the description of the Buddha's enlightenment, consider, just as a practical exercise, just as a philosophical exercise, if a person could do what's being described in that experience, what kind of mind is needed for them to finish the task? If you have infinite past lives, for example, and you have to recall them one at a time, one Buddhist position on the Buddha's omniscience that is often used in the Pali tradition is that the Buddha was capable of what's called serial omniscience, that he could be aware of anything he wanted to know, one thing at a time. But think about his experience under the Bodhi tree. If the Buddha had serial omniscience, how could the Buddha become aware of infinite past lives? If the Buddha was going through his memories of past lives one at a time, he would still be sitting under the Bodhi tree, and he would have never moved on to the infinite past lives of infinite beings, much less his enlightenment experience in terms of removing ignorance, karma, and so forth. So it's really, really important to think this issue through from a logical standpoint. In order to explain how the Buddha can become aware of infinite past lives of his own, you need a mind that's capable of knowing an infinite number of objects simultaneously, not in order, but at the same time. And thus, I think the argument, even from that first enlightenment experience, is better explained by an omniscient mind that is we would say, simultaneously omniscient mind, not a serially omniscient mind. Secondly, think about the second watch of the night. What does he realize? He recalls the infinite past lives of infinite beings. And not only does he do this, he sees the interactions, the connections between all of these different lives and sees patterns where people go up and they go down according to the different types of actions they perform. So, once again, how could an individual who can only see one event at a time become aware of infinite beings who have had infinite past lives and understand the infinite events that are involved in them infinitely into the past, going up and down in rebirth? I think the only way you can explain this is if the Buddha has an omniscient mind capable of knowing all objects simultaneously. Otherwise, you can't explain it. You certainly cannot explain this from the point of view of serial omniscience. The Buddha would still be sitting under the Bodhi tree, and we wouldn't be having this discussion. Next, I'd like you to take a look at this article. Debates and discussions of omniscience were actually a really, really, really important subject in Buddhism for a long time. And so Shantarakshita and also Kamalashila, who I mention quite often because I used Kamalashila's work in my master's work, these are both incredible Buddhist scholars from the height of Indian Buddhism. There were debates with both amongst Buddhists and between Buddhists and non-Buddhists about the nature of omniscience. And I'm not going to get into all of the details, but you can see that they spent a lot of time discussing and debating and trying to decide upon what the best possible explanation for and description of omniscience was from these 5 options. And the richness of even a short article like this one, you can start to get a sense of how detailed these debates and discussions became. And this was not a casual endeavor of simply faith. There was a great deal of thought that went into trying to understand the Buddha's statements about these issues. Furthermore, even in the Pali tradition, my Pali-loving friends, we find statements like this. On one occasion, the Buddha is talking to King Pasenadi, and King Pasenadi had heard someone say that the Buddha gave a certain teaching, and this is that teaching. It's not possible that a Brahmin or contemplative would claim a knowledge and vision that is all-knowing and all-seeing without exception. In other words, King Pasenadi had heard that the Buddha taught that omniscience was impossible, that being an omniscient being was impossible. And how does the Buddha respond to this? Great king, those who say that are not speaking in line with what I have said and are misrepresenting me with what is untrue and unfactual. There are other sources in the Pali Canon, 1 or 2, where the Buddha does in fact seem to be claiming total omniscience for himself. In particular, I would look at this source. In the Kalaka Sutta, the Buddha says, monks, Whatever in the cosmos, with its devas, maras, and brahmas, its generations with their contemplatives and brahmins, royalty and common people, is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, attained, sought after, pondered by the intellect. In other words, absolutely every object that exists, I am aware, I do know those objects. Furthermore, he says, if I were to say, I don't know whatever in the cosmos is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, pondered by the intellect, etc., that would be a falsehood in me. If I were to say, I both know and don't know, it would be the same. If I were to say, I neither know, it would be the same. So he's saying that I'm eliminating all of these other possibilities. And in fact, I know everything. So I'm not just saying he's an omniscient being because I'm a Mahayana practitioner and therefore I need to believe that. I think the explanation that he is an omniscient being in a simultaneous sense is a better explanation. And there's justification even in the Pali Canon for that position. Furthermore, of course, by the time we get to the Mahayana Canon, and I point to this sutra because it's a really important sutra in Zen, and people think Zen doesn't have any of this, and it absolutely does. So this is from the Chinese Agamas, the Chinese canon, which then gives birth to Chan practice, Zen practice, and so forth. In the Flower Garland Sutra, this passage is talking about the development of highly accomplished beings, and it's saying two things. One, that highly accomplished beings who are traveling down the path are beginning to approach these immeasurable states of knowledge, and the Buddha himself has infinite knowledge. And this includes knowledge of things like every atom that exists. And so now I'm going to show you a passage relevant to Chan practice and Zen practice. This is describing, I believe, a bodhisattva, an extremely high level of training, getting very, very close to Buddhahood. And you can see right here that enlightened beings have infinite knowledge. They have penetrating insight that is infinite. They have the vast extent of their knowledge is immeasurable. So according to this sutra, there are infinite Buddhas, there are infinite Buddha realms engaged in infinite activities, and all of them have infinite omniscience, right down to the atoms making up every single existent thing. They are entirely aware of the internal states, the stages of development, et cetera, of all sentient beings. So this is part of Zen. It is there in the Pali, and of course it's there in the Sanskrit going into the Tibetan tradition and into the Tantras. So this is all over the place. This isn't just some later invention or something. You find it everywhere, and it's a major topic of debate and discussion in the Buddhist tradition. Now I'm going to jump to another somewhat heavy-hitting critique. I've already addressed it in the past, but it's so important, I'm going to address it again. I don't want someone to think, you didn't get to this point in the book. Haha, we got you. The self we claim is actually non-existent. It exists nowhere, neither in our physical nor our mental parts. Skipping ahead a bit. Looking at this boat, is it the wood? Is it the motor? Is it the glue? Is it the paint? No, it's none of these. In the same way, the self does not exist in any of the individual elements that we are composed of, nor is it outside of them. Once we realize that the self doesn't exist, we find the middle way between asceticism and pleasure, and in that balance, life ceases to hold us hostage to our attachments. Jesus responds, listen to your own words. They speak a different message. Once we realize, we find the middle way. If she only knew, she would not be. Life ceases to hold us. All these assume a personality, Gautama. Who are we talking about? This you and she are particular individuals, not to be confused with any other, him or her. You cannot shake off the person no matter how hard you try, and it stands to reason. You cannot reconstitute reality just by changing the language. Now, of course, I've covered this in the past, but there are sources in the Pali Canon, for example, where the Buddha very clearly rejects both self and no self. So the Buddhist position is not that there is no self whatsoever, and the Buddhist position is not that there is the type of self you think there is. The type of self you think is there doesn't exist. Also, the self is not utterly non-existent. There's a self, it just doesn't exist the way that you think it does. How does it exist? As a dependent arising. So, Ravi actually gets fairly close to that in the first part of his description, and then he abandons it and goes right back to the standard Christian criticism, which is that no self exists whatsoever. Listen to the first part again. The self we claim is actually non-existent. You see it? The self we claim exists nowhere. The self we claim is neither in our physicality nor in our mental parts. Exactly right. But that doesn't mean, skipping down again, that we realize the self doesn't exist. What we realize is that the self we think exists doesn't exist. However, there is a self made up of your 5 aggregates. There is a self made up of various causes and parts. There is a self made up of subjects and objects. There's just not a self that exists utterly separate from that the way that it seems to you. So you do have a self. So who's the recipient of the Buddha's compassion? This young woman. So who's the recipient of the Buddha's compassion? We are. Who has that compassion? The Buddha does. He's a dependent arising. The compassion's a dependent arising. Work of dependent arisings. Dependent arisings are real things. It's just that we have a cognitive error. We make a mistake in our perception, and we see dependent arisings as being non-dependent arisings. We see relational things as being non-relational things. And because of this, that self, exactly right, does not exist. But a self that's dependent arising does exist. This is a critical distinction that anyone who's interested in Buddhism really has to get if you want to understand what we're talking about with selflessness, emptiness, these kinds of things. Even things like Buddha nature, which I don't have time to cover today, fall into this category. Okay, let's carry on. On page 30, Ravi has Buddha saying, "I'm not sure I like everything I see here, Jesus, I must admit. These temples have become puzzling places for me. I didn't want to be deified or made into a statue, the gold, the precious stones, all on a carved idol. I don't understand how all of this ritual and idolatry has come about. I told my followers not to be burdened with images and with worship, but they didn't listen." I've saved this for this point in the video because hopefully if you made it this far, you'll see it through. Whether you're talking about the Dhammapada, the rest of the Pali Canon, the Chinese Agamas, the Kongyur tradition of the Tibetans, which is mostly coming over from the Sanskrit, or the Sanskrit canon, or what we have of the Gandhari canon, the Buddha says that engaging in worship is one of the most powerful and important things you can do to accumulate good karma and merit on your way down the path to Buddhahood. What about all of these temples? What about all of these monasteries? What about all of these statues? What about all the paintings? What about the stupas, these towers that represent the mind of a Buddha? Why are we doing all of this? Didn't the Buddha say you shouldn't be attached to stuff? And why would we do all this? Well, let's get into it, because this is another thing that people absolutely have to understand about Buddhism, and the argument that's being made here is absolutely backwards. The first thing that's important to know is that the Buddha encouraged his followers at the time of the Buddha to open monasteries. So, for example, of course, many people know Arthapindika, who opened Jeta's Grove. The Buddha spent most of his intense retreat periods, he would do about 3 months of retreat per year, at Jeta's Grove Monastery, which was built by Anathapindika. The Buddha encouraged and said it was one of the most important and meritorious things a person could do to build monasteries to help house his students and himself. So in terms of monasteries and temples associated with monasteries, this is something that the Buddha encouraged during his own lifetime. But I'm not going to focus on Arthapindika because everyone knows that story. Let's look at Vishaka. Vishaka came from a wealthy family. She was one of the Buddha's foremost female disciples. She helped build a monastery. She met the Buddha at the age of 7 and attained what's called Sotapanna, the stream entry, where she's headed on her way to enlightenment, after hearing him give one teaching. Later, she moved to a different city. She married at the age of 16. She converted her father-in-law to Buddhism. She was blessed with 20 children, 10 sons and 10 daughters. And each of her children, they say, also had 10 more sons and daughters. And so by the time she passed away, she had something like 8,000 extended family members. In any case, she's one of these examples where you can begin to understand that, yes, you as a normal person can make plenty of progress down the path while having a family and being close to your family and so on and so forth. While the Buddha was still alive, the Buddha spent 6 of his rainy retreats out of 45 rainy retreats at this monastery, second only to Arthapindika's monastery at Jeta's Grove. So, to not belabor the point, monasteries were something that were quite important at the Buddha's time, and the Buddha endorsed this, and monasteries have been something that have been going on since the Buddha's time up until today. Secondly, what about stupas? What about these things that house the relics of great beings, including the Buddha? Well, in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, he gives this description to his follower. He says to Ananda, who was his chief attendant, as with the body of a universal monarch, a universal king, at the crossroads also a stupa should be raised for the Tathagata, the Buddha, and whosoever shall bring to that place garlands or incense or sandalwood paste, or pay reverence, and whose mind becomes calm there, it will be to his well-being and happiness for a long time. And why, Ananda, is a Tathagata, an Arahant, a fully enlightened one worthy of a stupa? Because, Ananda, at the thought, this is the stupa of that blessed one, Arahant, fully awakened one, the hearts of many people will be calmed and made happy, and so calmed, and with their minds established in faith therein, at the breaking up of their body, after death, they will be reborn in the realm of heavenly happiness. Or thinking, this is the stupa of a disciple of that Tathagata Arahant fully awakened one, the hearts of many people will be calmed and made happy, and so calmed, and with their minds established in faith therein, at the break of the body, after death, they will be reborn in a realm of heavenly happiness. So therefore, due to the faith and the awe and the gratitude that people feel through making offerings and so forth to stupas, beings will accumulate huge amounts of merit and be pushed further down the path, or just take a good rebirth, which is better than them taking a bad rebirth. Furthermore, if you look at the Tibetan and Sanskrit sources, there's a sutra called the Great Rumble Sutra. It talks about the immense benefits of creating stupas. So here's the Buddha once again speaking to Ananda, and he's talking about the palace of a god. He's saying the palace of this god, Shakara, is supported by 84,000 pillars, each of which is made of exquisite blue beryl, which is an incredible sort of stone. Ananda, the palace of victory, is covered with gold dust, sprinkled with sandalwood water, decorated with golden lattice, and encircled with golden chime. Ananda, if someone were to fill the tricolocosm, if someone were to fill the triple world, the entirety of existence, only with palaces like the Palace of Victory, and offer it to the Sangha of monks throughout the 4 directions. In other words, if someone offered palaces of the gods to the entire community of monks and nuns spread out across the entirety of reality, and another person, a different person, was to take the relic the size of a mustard seed after the thus come one, after the Buddha dies, if they were to just take a relic from him and place it inside a stupa in a dome the size of a small fruit, and a central pole the size of a needle, and affix it to a canopy the size of a jujube leaf. In other words, this little tiny stupa that you could fit in your hand. If someone just took a relic of the Buddha, put it inside a really, really tiny little representation of a stupa, it's a representation of the Buddha's mind, and it could fit in the palm of your hand. He says, the merit of the former would not even come close to 100th of the merit of the latter. It would not even be close to 1,000th, 100,000, any number or fraction, or anything comparable or relative to that. Why? Because the thus gone, in other words, the Buddha, worthy and completely perfected Buddhas, possess these immeasurable qualities. They possess immeasurable discipline, immeasurable samadhi, immeasurable insight, immeasurable liberation, and the immeasurable wisdom and vision of liberation. So since a Buddha has infinite good qualities and is infinitely benefiting all sentient beings, when you do things in relation to a Buddha that are virtuous, the virtue of that is so astonishingly great that even if you made offerings that were equivalent to the palace of a god, to the entirety of the rest of the Buddhist Sangha, you couldn't even compare the merit of that to the merit of doing something like making a representation of the Buddha's mind with a little relic of the Buddha inside. So the power of these objects is just beyond reckoning, beyond imagining. Now, what about statues and paintings? In the Sutra of the Mudra of Developing the Power of Devotion, it says, Manjushri, a son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage, could offer divine food endowed with hundreds of tastes and likewise divine garments with refreshed enthusiasm every day for eons equaling the sand grains in the river Ganga, in the river Ganges. To solitary realizer arhats, equaling the dust particles of all the realms of the universe. Solitary realizers are, of course, pratyeka Buddhas, for those who would like the proper terms. By comparison, Manjushri, this is the Buddha talking to Manjushri, if a son of the lineage or a daughter of the lineage, or anyone else, so he's talking about non-Buddhists here, just anybody, happens to see a painting of the Buddha or a statue of the Buddha, this generates countless greater merits. Because of this, there's no need to mention putting your hands together in prostration or offering incense, aromas, lights, which generates even greater countless merits. So what is he saying? He's saying that you could offer countless incredible divine offerings to countless pratyeka Buddhas, solitary realizer arhats, for a virtually unlimited period of time every day with refreshed enthusiasm every single day. And that wouldn't even equal the fraction of a non-believer simply seeing the image of a Buddha. Why? Well, once again, because Buddhas have limitless qualities. They have infinite perfected good qualities, according to the canon. So why is it important to create images, to have images around, to have monasteries, to have stupas? Because they create unbelievable merit for the beings who interact with them, in particular in a positive way, but also a number of beings simply by having them around. They're benefiting immensely. Okay? This whole thing about, well, we don't really know how all this Buddhist idolatry got here is just, these things are there in Buddhism from the very early stages. They're in our primary materials in the sutras. And these are things that are part of the tradition. And that's why every Buddhist tradition on earth that has a lineage that started before 1900, before the modern period, all of them have different kinds of stupas, different kinds of statues, different kinds of monasteries and temples, different kinds of holy sites, blah, 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 blah. Because this is what our tradition teaches. They didn't just make it up. Let's carry on. On page 31, here's Ravi as Jesus responding to the Buddha, covering all the ground that we just covered. First, you told them there is no God. Then you told them there is no self. You also told them there is no one to pray to. You also told them there is no evil one to fear. You told them everything is only within themselves, even though those selves do not exist. You instruct them that their good deeds have to outweigh their bad deeds. You carved into their consciousness a huge debt. You gave them scores of rules to live by. You told them all desires to be cut off. You told them you would cease to be, and when they had paid, they will cease to be also. How can all this bring peace, Gautama? Think about it. Remember Vikali. He wanted to see the Buddha, and the Buddha revealed that the Buddha and the Dharma are one. And therefore, if you see the Dharma, you see the Buddha. If you see the Buddha, you see the Dharma. Based upon this new conviction, this new settledness in his own training, Vikali attained nirvana. After Vikali passed away, there was an exchange between the Buddha and a number of other monastics who were around. The Blessed One, the Buddha, then addressed the bhikkhus, the monastic community, thus: Do you see, bhikkhus, that cloud of smoke, that swirl of darkness moving to the east, to the west, to the north, to the south, upwards, downwards, and to the intermediate quarters? And they respond, Yes, Venerable Sir. And the Buddha says, That, bhikkhus, is Mara, the evil one, searching for the consciousness of the clansman Vikali, wondering, where now is the consciousness of the clansman Vikali been established? However, bhikkhus, with consciousness unestablished, the clansman Vikali has now attained final nibbana. This word established and consciousness unestablished means that he has entered into the subtlest aspect of his mind. As I said in the previous video, there's this concept in the Pali sources of consciousness without surface. And the way this is described by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, for example, is as such. It's a type of consciousness not blanking out. It's not consciousness in the aggregate sense, though, as in your 5 consciousnesses you have as a human being, because it's beyond name and form. It's beyond your ordinary sense of body and mind. This is the same thing the Tibetans say, by the way. It's not the consciousness found in the formless jhanas. It's called consciousness without surface, a consciousness that, unlike the consciousness in the aggregates or in the jhanas, isn't known through the 6 ordinary senses, including the mental sense. The image is that of a light beam that doesn't land anywhere. If you had a light beam going through space and it didn't land on any material object, you wouldn't be able to see it because it wouldn't be reflected. It's through the reflections coming off surfaces that we see light. But if it doesn't land on anything, and that's how the Buddha talks about it, he calls it consciousness that's unestablished, a consciousness that doesn't land. It's bright in and of itself, but it doesn't appear as a brightness to anything else. And so it can't be located. And this is actually quite similar to the description of what in the Tagalog tradition, for example, they would call clear light, which is the subtlest mind that occurs at death. And this is the mind that would attain nirvana according to our system. If you attain nirvana, you're going to enter into clear light mind and absorb into your own nature. And at least from where I'm standing, seems to be a pretty significant overlap between these 2 systems. But let me point out one other thing. In what we read of Ravi's description of things, the Buddha is saying there's no actual evil being out there who's trying to stop you from doing all this. But that's not true. He describes Mara, a type of deva, or at least a class of devas or yakshas, a class of beings who are not human beings, who are trying to stop you from attaining realization. So the Buddha does actually describe not just an internal maras that you need to overcome, like your ignorance and your kleshas, but also external maras, that there are beings who, evil is a strong word, but they are certainly trying to stop you from actually accomplishing all this by doing whatever they can to interrupt the process of your training, if they can. So there is actually, for lack of a better term, evil in the world seeking to stop you from accomplishing the good, according to Buddhism. It's not just symbolic evil inside your heart. There are actually beings out there trying to stop you from being able to do all this. And so, once again, in a couple of critical respects, the argument that Ravi is putting in the mouth of Jesus Christ, by the way, is radically misinformed about what Buddhists actually think and believe. Returning to the text, page 32, here's Jesus once again. The purpose in life, Gautama, is communion, not union. There can be no meaning when the goal is to meditate oneself into oblivion. But meaning is found in relationship with the living God. That's what it's all about, a relationship. And I'm the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. He who comes to me will be fulfilled. I work the miracle of extinguishing destructive hungers and planting new legitimate hungers to take their place. I give to you life that is abundant. I offer a new relationship. As I mentioned before, in the Vakali Sutta, the Buddha says, one who sees the Dharma sees me. One who sees me sees the Dharma. For in seeing the Dharma, Vikali, one sees me. And in seeing me, one sees the Dharma. Dharma is the way. Dharma is the truth. And in terms of the life aspect, which is eternal life, the Dharma is nirvana. And in terms of eternal relationship, through the attainment of Buddhahood, you gain the ability, as it's said in the Flower Garland Sutra, to have infinite relationships with others for all time. So once again, we have infinite relationship with all other beings. You don't lose contact with everyone. And even, according to the Mahayana sources at least, if you enter into nirvana at some point in that condition of consciousness without surface in nirvana, a Buddha will wake you up out of it and encourage you to continue down the path to attain full Buddhahood, because we need everyone working on this project of helping all beings to achieve enlightenment. On page 33, getting near to the end now, Jesus says, "Now we're getting somewhere, Gautama. Why didn't you give them an abiding authority?" And Buddha says, "Because everything is impermanent." Jesus says, "Even that statement, is that impermanent too? There's no permanent truth if everything is impermanent. And even the statement that everything is impermanent is only impermanently true." This is the same argument that he makes in this clip.
Buddhism reverses that and says, while all that appears around us is actually permanent, what you have to do is shed that appearance and move towards an ultimate impermanence. You move from the appearance of permanence to the reality of impermanence, according to the Buddhists.
Now let's take a look at what the Buddha actually taught about permanent and impermanent things. The Buddha didn't teach that all things are impermanent. The Buddha taught that all compounded things, all caused and conditioned things are impermanent. And when you look at the definition of impermanence, the definition of impermanence has to do with the fact that something is constantly changing. A constantly changing thing that comes from other constantly changing things, a caused thing that comes from other caused thing, a thing made of parts coming from other things that have parts. Those things are impermanent and constantly changing. However, in the Buddhist worldview, there are also things that are unchanging, things that are permanent. Where do they come from? They come from the stopping of other things. For example, nirvana is a permanent and utterly reliable condition because it is a stopping of a caused and conditioned thing. In other words, the 12 links of interdependence that keep you stuck in samsara. It requires conditions to stop the 12 links, but the resultant state is not yet one more caused thing. It is the mind stream you have always had, absent the causal cycle within it that is suffering. And since you have simply removed something, the absence of that thing isn't caused. It required causes and conditions to destroy that cycle. But the simple absence of that thing, it's just the non-existence of something. And a non-existent thing just isn't there. So that absence is not a composed thing. And thus, something like nirvana can actually be logically established as reliable, utterly reliable for you. Likewise, as I've said in previous live streams, there's this concept of delusive obstructions and cognitive obstructions. Delusive obstructions stop you from attaining nirvana. And then after those are removed, what remains are what we call cognitive obstructions, those things that stop you from becoming omniscient. When you remove cognitive obstructions, which are composed things, caused things, what remains is a permanent state of omniscience because that omniscience is not itself a caused thing. You have simply removed those things that would stop you from knowing everything simultaneously from a Buddhist perspective. Before we get to the last quote of the day, I'd like to remind you once again that I do all of this for free. I'm trying as best I can to have no ads. I'm trying as best I can to do no paid promotions. And thus, in order to carry on doing this for free, sometimes 70, 100 hours a week, making content, teaching classes, doing live Q&As, speaking engagements, leading retreats, and so forth, I do need community support. So if you're finding value in this content, definitely subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Go to the links down below, send a small donation through, whatever you can afford. It means a tremendous amount because without the contributors, I'm not able to do this for free for everyone else. Okay, let's finish up. According to your teaching, you personally no longer exist, nor will she. Non-existence is the first gem. Next, the Dharma. The teaching has no eternal word to preserve, no absolute to be guided by. That's the second gem. The Sangha. The community that consists of those who believe no self exists and move toward not desiring anything, including the friendship of others. That's the third gem. And I'm hoping, dear audience, that by this time, you can see the problems baked into this way of conceiving of Buddhism. In brief, The Buddha doesn't teach that you don't exist. The Buddha teaches that you exist, but the way you exist is different than the way you thought. You exist as a dependent arising instead of something that exists absolutely independently of your body and mind. Far from saying that there's no eternal truth, the Buddha is the Dharma, in much the same way that Christ is seen to be the truth. The Buddha is the living embodiment of truth. Furthermore, the truth that he teaches is unchanging absolute truth, perennial truth, non-interpretable truth, in much the same way that Christianity claims to have an abiding, eternal, absolute truth. Because the truth that he teaches is not a composed thing. Because the truth of selflessness is an absence of something. The truth of impermanence is an absence of something. In the case of impermanence, it's an absence of stasis, which is a non-composed thing, and so that fact about composed things is unchanging. In the case of selflessness or emptiness, it's the absence of an inherent identity or the absence of the identity of that object or person that you think is there in the way you think it's there. The absence of that is an unchanging fact about all things that exist, and therefore it is a universal, unchanging fact, not a composed thing. So the truths that Buddha teaches are in fact absolute in the very same sense that Ravi is trying to establish truth. And to finish up, I'd like to talk about the Sangha and this issue of relationship, which is so important to modern Buddhism. Check this out. There are many passages in the Buddhist corpus talking about the importance of having friends, having colleagues, having companions. The Buddha encourages healthy friendships, healthy marriages, healthy relationships in communities, and so on and so on and so on. But let's focus in on the issue of teachers and healthy spiritual community. In the Half Sutta, the Half of the Holy Life Sutta, the Buddha is talking to Venerable Ananda, and Venerable Ananda says to the Buddha, "This is half of the holy life, Lord, having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues." And this term, admirable people, is a term that's best correlated in English to mentor, that you have people who are a little bit further along than you, that you're asking for advice and so forth. Those who are a bit further down the path than you, but I think it's being used here both to mean mentors and colleagues who are at about the same level as you, just the whole spiritual community that's supporting you in your endeavor. And the Buddha says, don't say that, Ananda. Don't say that. Having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues is actually the whole of the holy life. When a monk has admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues, he can be expected to develop and pursue the Noble Eightfold Path. And by having these admirable friends and companions and colleagues, they develop all of the elements of the path. And because of this reason, the Buddha says you can understand why this is actually the whole of the holy life. It is independence upon me as an admirable friend that beings subject to birth have gained release from birth, that beings subject to aging have gained release from aging, that beings subject to death have gained release from death, that beings subject to sorrow, lamentation, pain, that beings subject to sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair have gained release from sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair. It's through this line of reasoning that one may know how having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues is actually the whole of the holy life. So relationship with each other is the whole of the path. And if you're on the Mahayana path, your goal, your aim is to have infinite relationships with others for the remainder of time that are of the absolute highest quality, endowed with loving kindness and compassion forever, to bring beings the maximum benefit, both in a temporary sense and the maximum benefit in terms of meaning and purpose in the most ultimate possible universal, cosmological, teleological, soteriological sense. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up for the day. Thank you so much for coming. I hope to see you again soon. Cheers.
Buddha's opening lines, every birth is a rebirth. Every birth is a rebirth. But if every birth is a rebirth, then there had to be a first birth. What was the person paying for in their first birth? You had a finite number of rebirths. And in the first birth, what was it you were paying for by way of your karma if you hadn't had a previous birth? Was there a beginning? Or is there a continuous cyclicality with no beginning? Is that a rationally, existentially feasible concept? William Lane Craig, the Christian philosopher, says to talk about this eternal cyclicality and so on, he says, like trying to jump out of a bottomless pit. Where do you get started?